Adult Ed session together. Happy to welcome you for a 2-week special presentation on Bonhoeffer and Advent. My name is Christian Nguyen, the teaching minister here at Meeting House Church. Welcome to our friends who are watching online, whether you're on Zoom or on YouTube. So I'm super happy actually to be able to welcome today our speaker. I've been very eagerly waiting, getting a chance to have you come over and speak to us, Lori. She is, it was kind of funny actually because Lori was sitting with Sarah and all of a sudden it occurred to me that these are two of my bosses hanging out together. So Lori Brandt Hale is, she's the professor and chair of the Department of Religion and Philosophy at Augsburg University in Minneapolis. That's where I adjunct from time to time, and that's what I was referring to. She's also the vice president of the International Bonhoeffer Society English Language Section and a West Star Institute scholar. Brandt Hale is a co-editor of and contributor to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Theology and Political Resistance, the second volume in a series on faith and political theology by Lexington Books. Her chapter in the book offers, I think I need to, oh, there we go. Good, I got it. It offers a political theological reading, and it's titled The Interfaith Imperative, How Bonhoeffer Compels Interfaith Action. She's also the co-author of Bonhoeffer for Armchair Theologians, which is a great little short 110 or so page, very accessible. If you're interested in Bonhoeffer, I highly recommend this series produced by Westminster John Knox. She's written numerous articles and book chapters on Bonhoeffer's political resistance, his understanding of vocation and relevance in contemporary times, and the kind of perennial question that sort of has been coming up, it seems like, for the last couple of decades: is this a Bonhoeffer moment? And I think last but not least, she's just an amazing human being, a wonderful mother, and a wonderful colleague. So with that, come on up here. Let's give this a welcome. Yeah, absolutely. Welcome.
Well, thank you for that amazing invitation, or welcome, and the invitation to come, the amazing invitation to come, and the welcome to be here, and that introduction. Thank you, Christian. And I want to just say good morning and thanks to all of you for being here, for coming to this. I have old eyes, so they're going to be on and off. I'm just going to tell you right now, the glasses are going to be on and off. So I'm really delighted to be here during Advent for this 2-part series on reading Bonhoeffer in Advent, in the season of waiting, of preparing, of expectant hope, and love, as we heard this morning in the message, if you were here to listen to Sarah speak. As I was preparing for today, I was remembering a chapel talk I gave at Augsburg during the season of Advent on waiting. And it seemed like it was just a few years ago, but I looked it up and it was 14 years ago. In that message, I opened with a story that at the time was recent, about waiting in the ER with my middle son to get stitches in his chin. He was 5.5 at the time. Why he needed stitches is a story for another time. I'll just say it included standing on a basketball, so that, enough said. But in that message, I talked about the different kinds of waiting we do, right? Waiting in the ER, waiting for your oil to be changed, is different than the kind of hopeful and expectant waiting that we do during Advent. And it would be pretty easy to spend an hour or 2 hours this week and next week looking at passages from Bonhoeffer that speak to this sort of expectant waiting. His theology is inherently Christological. It is Christ-centered, starting back in his dissertation in Sanctorum Communio, written when he was only 21 years old. So we could do that. We could just look at those passages. In fact, there's a little volume called Bonhoeffer at Christmas. It's a kind of a gift volume that has just selections from his work for this season. But I'm going to push a little bit on this Advent theme of waiting. And prompted by a careful reading, I'm going to push a little bit on this theme in a little bit of a different direction. And you'll notice on my slides that there's a subtitle. So reading Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Advent, what are we waiting for? And if it sounds rhetorical, if it sounds a little bit like an exhortation, then that's on purpose. So anyway, so I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. We'll come back to that. So I know some of you have already spent quite a bit of time maybe reading and learning about Bonhoeffer. I heard in the whispers before this started that someone's in a Bonhoeffer reading club. I won't mention names, Dale. And I know some of you did a session, I think you did a session a few years ago, sort of an extended series on Bonhoeffer. So this is always the challenge coming into a setting like this, and we have folks online, welcome if you're online, where some people are quite familiar and some people aren't. And so trying to find that middle lane, so we're either refreshing some memories or introducing folks who are new. So in the spirit of finding that middle lane, I'm gonna do a couple things this morning. I'm gonna talk for about 15, 20, maybe 25 minutes, and do kind of a brief overview. So I'll start with biography and kind of talk about Bonhoeffer's life. So if you're brand new to Bonhoeffer, you'll kind of get the story. And then I'll kind of do a little bit of a rewind and do a little overview of his sort of theological and ethical claims that unfold over the course of his life. And I'm going to use this normally in a session like this. Normally, we wouldn't have all the cameras. I'd be walking around. I'd have maybe carry the mic with me. Normally, I wouldn't. I would just speak extemporaneously. I'm going to stick to a script so that I can stick to that time for two reasons. One, I want to have some time for us to have some discussion. And two, I'm currently teaching a seminar. It's actually a gen ed course, but it's a course dedicated to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So I right now have about 50 hours worth of material kind of ready at hand. And whatever you put in the oven this morning before you left might burn if we have to stay for the whole thing. So just to recap. So I'll talk for a little bit. We'll have some conversation together, and then we'll come back and join into sort of a large group discussion, kind of like class. I did put index cards on most of the tables, and I have more if you need more. I'll hand those. So if you have questions as I go, if you want to jot them down, if you have questions during our discussion and want to jot them down, we both can bring them forward today, but I also can take them with me so that maybe I can return to those questions with some intention next week when I come back. This is also, I'll just say, this is not any kind of book plug, but I did bring my books along, a couple of my books along, just in case you want to look. So here's the armchair book that Colin mentioned, and here's the book on theology and political resistance, which is a collected volume of essays. So they can float around. I'll send those around. All right. So Dietrich Bonhoeffer, theologian, pastor, Nazi resistor, was born February 4th, 1906, along with his twin sister Sabina, into a very large, tight-knit family. It was a highly educated family, politically engaged, but only nominally religious. And nobody expected Bonhoeffer to pursue a theological education. Rather, he was, and you may know this already, he was a very accomplished pianist. And so there was a lot of thought in his family that he would become a professional musician. However, by age 13, he announced that he would become a theologian. There were some events that happened along the way that prompted this thinking and some of the questions he had, including the death of his older brother Walter in World War I, which had a powerful impact on his whole family, including him, and he and his twin sister started asking questions about life and death and things that pushed him, I think, in this direction to pursue this course of study. But when he announced this, his older brothers mocked him, warning that becoming a theologian would amount to a retreat from reality. But Bonhoeffer's theological path would not lead him away from the world, but in fact more deeply into it. Famously, he wrote, and this he wrote in his letters and papers from prison, "The ultimately responsible question is not how I extricate myself heroically from a situation, but how a coming generation is to go on living." So he first studied at Tübingen and then at the University of Berlin, and he finished his doctoral dissertation Sanctorum Communio in 1927. He served for a year as an associate pastor in Barcelona before writing another dissertation, a postdoctoral dissertation, Act in Being, and then headed to a fellowship at Union Theological Seminary in New York during the 1931 academic year. It would be difficult to overstate the impact of Bonhoeffer's year at Union and the impact that it had on his thinking, his experiences, his observations, friendships there, as well as his connections to the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem were life-changing. And so you may know some of the names that are associated with his time in Union. So professors like Reinhold Niebuhr, friends like Jean Lasserre and Albert Franklin Fisher, who was an African-American student from the South, really shaped his experiences while he was there. He began to see the events of the world from below, from the perspective of real and racialized human beings suffering in the world. So the year at Union was also instrumental in Bonhoeffer's move toward ecumenism. When he returned to Germany, he took on roles as a youth secretary in 2 international ecumenical councils. He started lecturing at the University of Berlin, and he served as a student chaplain working in a working-class neighborhood in the city. His work in the church and the community influenced his academic inquiry and teaching. His questions, even in the classroom, were less exercises in academic abstraction and conjecture and more existential and urgent questions about life and faith, eventually leading him to the question, who is Jesus Christ for us today? The rise of the National Socialists in Germany had concerned the Bonhoeffer family since before Dietrich's return from New York. The ascent of Adolf Hitler to power at the end of January of 1933 brought their fears to the fore. Immediately, Bonhoeffer delivered a radio address warning his fellow Germans against making an idol of the Führer. He said when people, Führer means leader, right? When people make an idol of the leader, that leader becomes a misleader. I'll just add a note. Famously, that speech was cut short. And early on, there was speculation that maybe the Nazis already had the ability to cut it short. He just ran out of time. He went over time. So it's not quite as dramatic as it might seem at first. But he did spend the next couple of weeks distributing copies of his notes. He wanted to make sure that people had heard the entire speech. And just think about how early that is, right? This speech was 2 days after Hitler took power. So he had this vision, this insight so early when so many of his friends and fellow theologians and others just didn't have that. And again, that time in Union was instrumental in sort of reshaping his consciousness, reshaping his imagination, giving him insight into the dangers that were presented by the Nazis. All right. So within months, and again, my students are always kind of surprised by this. You think about the war, you think about the Holocaust, and you think kind of late 1930s, early 1940s. But Hitler took office in January of 1933, and within months, concentration camps were under construction. There was a boycott of Jewish businesses. By April 1st, the Aryan Paragraph, which removed all Jews and persons of Jewish descent from civil service, was also passed in April of 1933. And then the other thing that was happening was this they were working to unify the sort of regional independent Landskirche into a unified Reichskirche, into a national state church. And under the pressure from the Nazi leadership, a bishop for that church was elected in the summer of 1933, Ludwig Müller, who was a Nazi sympathizer. And so then the church adopted a version of the Aryan paragraph where pastors who had Jewish ancestors could no longer hold the pulpit. So that adoption of that statement for Bonhoeffer and others constituted what is known as a status confessionis. It required a stance of confession because it stood in contradiction to the gospel itself. So in September of 1933, Bonhoeffer, Martin Niemöller, and others formed the Pastors' Emergency League in response. The Bethel Confession was published, followed soon thereafter by the Barmen Theological Declaration, and then the creation of what is known as the Confessing Church. Now, Bonhoeffer had helped draft the Bethel Confession, though he refused to sign the final watered-down version of it. And so in both frustration and humility, he left for London in October of 1933 to lead 2 German-speaking churches there, and he called it his retreat to the wilderness, right? He wasn't quite sure what his role was in Germany, and he needed to think that through. About a year and a half later, in 1935, he accepted an invitation then to come back as the director of the Preacher's Seminary for this new confessing church. The confessing church confessed that Jesus Christ was Lord and no other, and of course the unwritten subtext of that is not Hitler, right? He went first to, the seminary was first in a place called Zingsthof, and then it moved to Finkenwalde, and when he accepted this position, it meant that he had to abandon a planned trip that he had made to go to India and study with Gandhi, to study nonviolent resistance with Gandhi. So that's something you may or may not know, that he had made those arrangements and was all set to go until he decided this was, in fact, his calling was to come to the Preacher Seminary. So at Finkenwalde, he tightly structured the days of the seminarians. He was, in fact, accused of legalism, of fostering a monastic retreat from the world, when his intention was, in fact, to prepare students for the difficult lived reality of life in parish ministry in opposition to the Nazi regime. So he was trying to give these were old men, these young men, the resources that they were going to need when they went back out into the world. One of his first students was a student named Eberhard Bethke, and they became very close friends. And as those of you who've studied Bonhoeffer will know that then Bethke became his biographer, and really is responsible. He, along with his wife Renata, who was Dietrich Bonhoeffer's niece, we won't get into all the details there. They did meet through Dietrich. We have Bonhoeffer's works. We know about Bonhoeffer because of the Bethkes. They were the sort of first folks to make sure that his work was published and available to the world. And we'll come back, if you've looked a little bit at the handout, we're going to look at a passage that was written on the occasion of the baptism of their oldest son. So the seminary operated without interference from the state until it was closed by the Gestapo in September of 1937. Bonhoeffer's friends abroad, of course all those friends he had made in New York and beyond, were worried for his safety. So with their help, he returned to the United States in June of 1939. But he never felt settled about this decision, and so within a month, he returned to Germany. And he wrote, I quote, "Christians in Germany will face a terrible alternative of either willing the defeat of their nation in order that Christian civilization may survive, or willing the victory of their nation and thereby destroying our civilization. I know which of these alternatives I must choose, but I cannot make that choice in security," end quote. So upon his return, he began work as an agent of the Abwehr, the German military intelligence, and which was, in fact, the seat of resistance. So ostensibly, Bonhoeffer was using his ecumenical contacts throughout Europe to gather information for the Nazis, when in reality, he was passing information about the resistance in the other direction. He was actually trying to negotiate terms of surrender if their coup was successful, and that he wasn't finding much ground there. But it's in this context that he began to work on his book known as Ethics. Like I said, I'll circle back to the themes in just a moment. On April 5th, 1943, Bonhoeffer was arrested on tenuous charges related to his resistance work, and he was sent to Tegel prison in Berlin. More than a year later, so he'd been in prison for more than a year, on July 20th, 1944, the final attempt from this group, the Canaris conspiracy, their final attempt on Hitler's life failed. That you may be familiar with this famous event and date. The Gestapo subsequently discovered files in which Bonhoeffer was implicated in the planned coup. And so in October, he was taken to the Gestapo prison in Berlin, and then he was moved to Buchenwald concentration camp in February, and then on to Flossenburg camp, where on April 9th of 1945, he was executed by hanging. He was only 39 years old when he died. His family and friends, including his fiancée Maria von Wiedemeyer, did not learn of his death until the end of June. His brother, so he had brothers and brothers-in-law. This is Hans van Donani in the glasses and Rudiger Schleicher, both brothers-in-law, and Klaus Bonhoeffer, and then Colonel Oster. They were all also involved in the conspiracy, and they were all also murdered in that same week of April in 1945. So that's the brief kind of overview of his biography. So let me say a few things about how his theological thinking evolved over the course of his life. Because as his theological thought was evolving, and it was evolving in the context of this very tumultuous time and historical context. But there's continuity in his thought from his earliest work to his prison writings. And I think that continuity is just remarkable. So his dissertation, I do think, and this is kind of small, but you have it on your handouts. If you look at the bibliography, you'll see that his collected works are 17 volumes in total. That includes an index. And the first 9 volumes, the first 8 volumes, the first 8 are kind of his primary texts. The second half of the series is more additional letters and historical contextual pieces and things like that. So I'll just run through quickly just so you have a sense of this. So his dissertation, Sanctorum Communio, a theological inquiry into the sociology of the church, includes concepts that he continues to develop in Act and Being, in discipleship, in ethics, and in his letters and papers from prison. So that dissertation was written under the supervision of Reinhold Seeberg in 1927 and published in 1930. It was his dissertation. He was a student, and it was about a lot of things. It was an inquiry on the subject of religious community, and it led him to conclude that basic existential, ontological, which is just questions about being, theological, and ethical questions have an integrated answer. Namely, he says that concepts of person, community, and God are inseparably and essentially interrelated. It was deemed a theological miracle by theologian Karl Barth. I'm guessing you've talked about Karl Barth a few times. And Bonhoeffer's work posits theology as inherently social. So theology is social. And he maintains that what it means to be, that's that ontological question, what it means to be human comes in encounter with and ethical response to other humans. So these ideas align with Bonhoeffer's concept of something called Stellvertretung, which is translated as vicarious representative action. And he introduces that idea in his dissertation as a theological concept. It is Christ's vicarious representative action on behalf of fallen humanity, he asserts, that restores community between humans and God as well as between humans. So put another way, there's a famous dictum that comes out of his dissertation, Christ existing as community, this idea uncovers Bonhoeffer's understanding that the church is both the ongoing revelation of God in the world and a concrete community. So the church is both a concrete community now, and it's the place where God continually shows up in the world. And so I was thinking about these themes are kind of appropriate for Advent, right? We're thinking about the coming of God into the world. He's talking about the ongoing incarnation of Christ in community in the church. Act in Being, the subtitle, it's a mouthful. This whole book this would be the hardest, I think, of his things to read. Transcendental Philosophy and Ontology and Systematic Theology. There will not be a quiz, I promise you. So this is, it's called his Habilitationsschrift, or a second postdoctoral dissertation, and he had to write it to qualify to be a lecturer at the University of Berlin. It was written in 1929, submitted in 1930, and published in 1931. And his primary task is methodological. He's taking up this problem of act and being. And so this gets into the weeds. I don't know that I'm going to get into those weeds right now. Basically, it engages in constructive thinking about intersubjectivity, how we relate to each other, otherness, and responsibility. And those are themes that continue to be really important throughout his work. So then, Volume 3, Creation and Fall, a theological exposition of Genesis 1 through 3. So this is the creation stories and the expulsion from the garden. These are actually captured as lectures. So it's the published manuscript of lectures he gave at the University of Berlin in 1933. And so students happily took really good notes, and these are published from student lecture notes. And again, if you think about 1933, he's giving these lectures as Hitler's coming to power. And you know that Germany was in absolute turmoil between the wars, right? Financial, social, there was just, everything was difficult. And so he's writing this in the midst of social and political upheaval in Germany. The influence of Barth on Bonhoeffer's approach to reading the Bible is clear, both in his attention to reading the text as a living word and in the lecture's inherent critique of morality, or the conflation of faith and ethics. But it serves as a pivot point in Bonhoeffer's work. He continues to consider questions raised in his dissertation. It includes key themes of work that he's going to talk about later, and it brings to the fore what he talks about as an ethic of responsibility and a theological anthropology that is intrinsically Christological. So again, as Sarah would say, in the ordinary language, Christ, he just has a Christ-centered theology throughout his life. At the same time, he affirms the Old Testament as part of the Christian canon and embraces what he calls its earthiness. Now, moving on to discipleship, you may know this as the cost of discipleship, right? So the German title for this text is Nachfolge, following after, translated now simply as discipleship. It's a popular text, and it's where he draws the distinction between cheap grace and costly grace. So I think the original English translators were trying to get that idea into the title. That's why it was formerly published as The Cost of Discipleship. And it often gets misread as a guide to Christian spirituality divorced from the world. Rather, Bonhoeffer's work on grace rectifies a long-standing misunderstanding of Martin Luther's doctrine of justification by asserting a connection between faith and obedience. Informed by his rereading of the biblical text, of New Testament stories calling people to discipleship, of the Sermon on the Mount calling people to love their enemies, Bonhoeffer's discipleship, that text, is an astute, politically informed call to live and suffer vicariously on behalf of others in commitment and obedience to Christ alone. So that idea of Stellvertretung comes back up, that vicarious representative action, and it's tied up with his understanding of responsibility in the world. When the seminary was closed then, he could not stay there, and so he went away and he wrote about it. He wrote about the experience there in the little book that you also might know called Life Together. And he wrote it in 4 weeks Yeah. It was published in 1939. It describes the details of life in Christian community, the way he organized it at the seminary. It includes thoughts about time together, time alone, time in prayer, including intercessory prayer, praying on behalf of others, and time in service. And so the Christological and ecclesiological, which means the community, concepts of community and church, those foundations of Bonhoeffer's, what he set out as foundations in his dissertation on ideas of Christology and ecclesiology, what it means to be church, come to kind of concrete expression in the way he organized the seminary and then writes about it in Life Together. So you get some ideas about it in the dissertation, then you get it put into practice in Life Together. So 2 more things to talk about, his ethics and letters and papers from prison. And so Ethics is a collection of 13 manuscripts, not a completed monograph. It was arranged and published by Eberhard Bethge, his best friend, in 1949, 5 years after Bonhoeffer died. He had envisioned his ethics as his magnum opus, his great work. And in it, he rejects the idea that ethics can be universally valid or derived from general principles. So typically, if you think about ethics or ethicists, you think about these principles that are always true, kind of in all times and all places, right? Rather, he advances a Christological understanding of responsibility that is tied to concrete reality. And he reiterates his idea that one is called to respond to another in need. So he writes, this is one of my favorite passages from the Ethics. He writes, Christ was not concerned whether the maxim of an action could become a principle of universal law, but whether my action now helps my neighbor to be a human being before God. Bonhoeffer's theological understanding of Stellvertretung, introduced earlier in his dissertation, developed in discipleship, now finds its kind of ethical footing here. So that idea of vicarious representative action, which was a theological idea based on the life of Christ, now carries some ethical weight in terms of what it means to be a disciple and how we live out our lives in the world. And then finally, we have letters and papers from prison. It's a collection of letters, poems, prayers, meditations, and an outline for a book written by Bonhoeffer during his imprisonment. It was published posthumously in 1951, so that's only 6 years after he died. The collection also includes an important prologue called An Account at the Turn of the Year 1942-1943. Again, formerly this was just called After 10 Years, and if you do the math, it's written at the turn of the year, 42, 43, so Hitler's been in power for 10 years. And it's written as a letter of support to his co-conspirators. It's a poignant reflection on a decade of Nazi tyranny in which Bonhoeffer makes an appeal to see the events of the world from the perspective of those who suffer, from what he calls the view from below. Critical, though fragmentary, theological content appears in theological letters beginning in April of 1944. So initially, he was writing letters to and from his family. They went through all the official channels, which meant they were subject to censorship. He could only write every 10 days or so. But as his imprisonment went on and he knew that he was there to stay, he started writing down some of his theological ideas, musings, ways that his thoughts were shifting and changing, and sending those to his friend Eberhard. And those letters were smuggled in and out of the prison by a guard. And so sometimes if you hear a reference to Bonhoeffer's prison theology, it's referring to those letters that were written in the spring and summer and early fall of 1944 before he was moved. And so in those theological letters or in that prison theology, Bonhoeffer reconsiders the question, who is Christ actually for us today? And suggests that we live in a world that has come of age. That's a couple of days of conversation right there. And proposes a non-religious interpretation of Christianity or a religionless Christianity. Again, that's a long conversation, what that looks like. But he returns again, I think, to this really key question, who is Jesus Christ for us today? And we already heard that he had this that he had this idea way, way early in his thinking, in his dissertation, about the idea that the church is the place where the ongoing incarnation of Christ happens in the world, in the church community. And so I want to, this is what I want to kind of play with a little bit, that this question of Bonhoeffer, so this question at this time of Advent when we think about Christ coming into the world, gives us the chance to say, well, who is Christ for us today? And I'd like to flip that question and say, who are we then as Christians in the world today? What does that look like for us? So I'd like to invite you then to, so I have this on the screen, which might be too little, but on your tables there are handouts, and I've got this passage typed up for you. So this is coming out of this this period of the prison theology from the spring of 1944. So, like I said, Eberhard, through Dietrich, had met Renata Schleicher, the daughter of his sister Ursula. And so they had gotten married while Bonhoeffer was in prison and had their first child, Dietrich William Rudiger Bethke. And so there's a very long sort of baptismal sermon that he writes, and so you can read the whole thing in Letters and Papers from Prison. And so I'd like you to look at this particular passage. I'll just read it. You are being baptized today as a Christian. All those great and ancient words of the Christian proclamation will be pronounced over you without your understanding any of it. But we too are being thrown back all the way to the beginning of our understanding. What reconciliation and redemption mean, rebirth and Holy Spirit, love for one's enemies, cross and resurrection, what it means to live in Christ and follow Christ. All that is so difficult and remote that we hardly dare speak of it anymore. In these words and actions handed down to us, we sense something totally new and revolutionary, but we cannot yet grasp it and express it. This is our fault. Our church has been fighting during these years only for its own self-preservation, as if that were an end in itself. It has become incapable of bringing the word of reconciliation and redemption to humankind and to the world. So the words we used before must lose their power, be silenced. And we can be Christians today in only two ways, through prayer and doing justice among humans. So what I'd like to invite you to do is, for a moment at your tables, is to talk. I have these two sentences that I put in italics that I'd like you to think about. It might be interesting for you to note that in earlier English translations of this text, it was translated as prayer and righteous action, that we can only be Christians today in two ways, through prayer, and originally it would have been, I'm trying to find my notes here, righteous action among men or something like that, right? So it's like righteous action among men, then it was prayer and righteous action. And now in the new critical translations, it's through prayer and doing justice among humans. The German word in question here is gerechten and carries strong connotations of equity and fairness. So if you would, at your tables, sort out, what do you think these two sentences in italics mean? What do they mean to you? What do they mean to you? What do they mean for this community? What do they mean for the church writ large? Maybe it involves a question about thinking about justice, because that's actually a complicated idea. So what is justice? So I'll give you a few minutes to talk, and then I'll love to take your questions back, and we'll come back together in about 10 minutes to debrief. And if you're online, maybe you can put notes in the chat, or if you're with somebody in your home, you can talk to each other. Thanks. So this is the hardest part of putting you in conversation groups, is asking you to stop great conversation. But I am watching the time. So Christian has a microphone, so if there are some questions from the floor, I would be happy to start a conversation. And while he's before she jumps in, I just want to say that my intention then is to collect your cards. Anything we don't get to today, I'll take them with me, and as I'm preparing next week, then I can try to address some of the questions that you might have coming out of today. So.
We were wondering why doing righteous action was translated as doing justice, when righteous action is a lot broader than doing justice and includes things like loving your neighbor, being kind to others.
So I'll tell you, so I'm hoping that this is the kind of conversation you all had at your tables, and maybe some of you have some thoughts. I will just, I guess I'll start with why I prefer the new translation, the Doing Justice translation. So as I said, the German word does have connotations of equity and fairness, so I think it's a fair translation to move it to justice. But I think my preference for the new translation lies that, it's connected to the next quote that you have. Let's look at this for 1 minute. So the next quote, which I didn't have you look at yet, comes from his outline of a book in August, where he says, "The church is church only when it is there for others. The church must participate in the worldly tasks of life in the community, not dominating, but helping and serving, confronting the vices of hubris, the worship of power, and illusionism as the roots of all evil." And so my preference for this new translation, Doing Justice, over righteous action, lies in the way Doing Justice points to this vision for the church for others, and more explicitly, to my mind, includes that critique of the church as an institution of power and need of self-preservation. So if you go back to that other italicized line where he's saying part of what he's worried about is that the church has just been fighting for self-preservation, right? And so righteous action leaves the door open to acting righteously, one might presume, but acting on behalf of power rather than on behalf of people. And so in a longer presentation, I gave it another, I'm gonna say it, but I'm gonna say it a little out of context. In another presentation I gave, where I looked at the way Bonhoeffer can be helpful in combating things like Christian nationalism, then I would say this change of language, again, puts that focus on helping other people, on not serving power, not preserving power, so that if you look at the folks, for example, who were on the Capitol on January 6th, a lot of them thought they were doing something righteous and doing righteous action. And so doing justice helps us, this change helps us think about that differently and offers a sort of a critique when we see people acting in ways that we find problematic and can't quite find the language to address that. Did that make sense, all of those pieces together? Yeah.
Given the time that was going on how did he become conjoined with his brothers-in-law and that they were all executed also? What was the genesis of that?
So his brother-in-law, Hans von Donani, was a lawyer in the Abwehr, in the German military intelligence, and it was that was, again, the seat of that resistance. And so there was quite a bit of, so one of the things that happened is when Hitler took power in the early 1930s, that group from the beginning started paying attention to human rights violations and keeping a sort of a dossier of materials that they thought they might be able to use at some point to prosecute him in some kind of international court of law when the time was right. So again, the Bonhoeffer family was already involved. Bonhoeffer had stayed out of that involvement, and then when he went to New York in 1939, that summer when because he was being watched, right? There were limitations on what he could publish, there were limitations on what he could say publicly. He didn't have a lot of options for what he could do, especially after the seminary was closed. He was also receiving conscription letters, and he was afraid that the longer he put off the draft, the more attention he would bring to his family, who was already involved in resistance. So he went to New York. His friends were concerned. He just felt like that if he wasn't there to participate in the suffering, he would have no right to have a voice in the reconstruction, both of Germany, of Christendom, and so he came back. And I think when he came back, he knew he had to make a choice, right? And so he got involved, but I said he was involved at kind of he was never someone who was he was never gonna be an assassin. He was never gonna, take the bomb in the briefcase, but he was trying to, again, negotiate with other countries. So, for example, he was very close friends with Bishop George Bell in England, in London, who sat in the Parliament, and so he had reached out to him, who took it to the floor, and they said, well, that's great. If Germany wants to clean house internally, that's great, but we're not going to make any promises in advance about how we're going to respond to that. So I don't know if that answers your question. Once there was a debate then among the conspirators about whether they should destroy this evidence that they had been collecting, and they decided they would hide it. It named everybody who had been involved. And so once that last attempt on Hitler's life failed in July of 1944, they hadn't hidden it well enough. So it was found, and then that's how everybody was identified who had been part of the attempt, part of the coup.
We talked a little bit about this at our table, and I'm struck as we're studying this, what a big perspective on its role the church had, or at least that part of the church had. I mean, they're taking a role in big international things. And it seems the church today has kind of shrunk in terms of its perspective. And I mean, we seem to have shrunk more to focusing on individual faith, not on big national issues, although there are big issues around. Can you comment on that at all, or I don't know I'm not asking a question. I'm just making an observation.
Well, I would actually put some caveats on the role the church was playing, whether we're talking about the confessing church in that context, because well, we can start. So first of all, in 1933. The Catholic Church signed a concordat with the Nazis that basically said, we'll stay out of your way if you stay out of ours. So they kind of take a back seat. Then the Reich Church becomes sort of enmeshed with the Nazi ideology and party. So if you walk into a German Deutsche Kirche, a German church, national church, there would be flags with swastikas flying on either side of the altar. So that's problematic. And then the confessing church initially took this really strong stand, including one of the reasons they had this underground seminary was the seminarians didn't want to have to sign loyalty oaths to Hitler. But as time went on, as things got more difficult, as these pastors went out into churches, they no longer collectively supported that decision. And so it became incumbent on individual pastors to make that choice alone, which makes them more vulnerable. And so Bonhoeffer was actually quite disappointed, even with the confessing church in that time. So in fact, in November 9th of 1938, you might recognize that date as Kristallnacht, the night where Jewish businesses, homes, and synagogues were destroyed throughout Germany. This was a point in Bonhoeffer's own work where up to that point, he had written explicitly and clearly about loving one's enemies, and that language kind of drops out after 1938, and he starts talking about responsible action instead. And he was very disappointed because the confessing church did not speak out against that event. And so all of this is to say, I think your point about the current church, that question, that implicit question about what is the church doing, the church writ large doing now, is a great question. But I don't think we actually have a great example in the German context either. So it's a fraught question. I think we have time for one or two. We're at time, so I'll let you tell me how long we can go over.
This will be easy. And please don't take my question the wrong way. But can you discuss the ethics of a Christian leader attempting an assassination?
So, yeah, not an easy question,
That's
but
easy.
yeah. So Bonhoeffer never tried to justify his role in the, excuse me. He never tried to, pardon me, he never tried to justify it. He never said that in this set of circumstances, thank you. He never said, I mean, he made some, well, and this is being recorded, this is great. I don't know where this frog is just like come out of nowhere. Wow, you really, I do want to answer this question. All right, we're going to go with it this way. I am not even a bit sick. I don't know what's going on. Okay. He didn't try to justify it. He said, and he did make some inquiries into tyrannicide and kind of the ethics of that, but at the end of the day, he said there is no set of circumstances where this is okay, where murder is okay, where this is justified. And so in that essay at the beginning of Letters and Papers from Prison, that account at the turn of the year, the letter of support to the co-conspirators, he talks about the fact that they have to hope and pray for a God who will forgive them when they become sinners in answering the call that they feel they have to answer. So, I mean, the other way you can think about it, or the other way that people have talked about it, is that he was also in a situation where to act was to take on guilt, and to not act was to take on guilt. So, so that's one answer. That's a short answer to a difficult question.
I think we have time for one more, and I think there's one up here. And I just want to encourage you, if you have questions that are written down, if you'll leave them on your table, I'll collect them at the end.
Thank you. One of the things I love about Bonhoeffer was that he was who he was in the muddiness of it all. And, you know, in this last quote, the church is a church only when it is there for others. Well, that sounds as if the church is all the perfect people, for all the people who need them. But the church is messed up itself, always.
Yeah.
We are all sinners, trying to do for others, but also for each other. So, and then there are the saints who never darken the door, you know. But I think what Bonhoeffer struggled was with personal responsibility and obedience. But if we are careful with determining rightly what God intends us to do for others, for His glory, then you have to be very careful with that. It maybe clears the way to get out of the mud. I don't know. Anyway, what does Bonhoeffer say?
I think that's a beautiful comment. I guess I'll leave you with one of my favorite sentiments in Bonhoeffer that I keep coming back to, that it keeps me coming back to Bonhoeffer, and it's part of a letter he wrote to Eberhard on July 21st, 1944. So if you note that date, it's the day after the failed attempt. And there is I used to think that he didn't know that it had failed, and actually a German scholar who was friends with Eberhard, we had a conversation. He said, I think he did know. I think he did know that it had failed. And on July 21st, he wrote that he thinks the way that we can have faith is by living in the full this worldliness, the muddiness of life, in the tasks and questions and joys and successes and perplexities and all of that messiness. And he says that's what he thinks it means to have faith. He says that's what it means to stay awake with Christ in Gethsemane. And that is metanoia, that is transformation, and that's what it means to be Christian and a human. So, thanks.
Thank you so much, Lori, for coming and gracing us with your presence and presentation. Let me say a quick word to bless as we go forth. I do want to remind you, Lori will be coming back next week. And again, if you have questions, please leave those. And she will be integrating them into, and so, hopefully some of them, into her presentation for next week as well. So let's pray together. Lord, we do thank you for this season of waiting, this season of anticipation, when we turn towards your future, a future that's not receding but is rather coming towards us. Prepare us during this time to receive you in a new way, to receive you in the face of a stranger, to receive you in a situation where we can help, to receive you in a situation where we can be helped. We ask and pray that you go with us now. Pray that you bless my brothers and sisters, both those in our room and those who are watching online. In Jesus' name, amen.